When we look at fossils, we see things that don't make sense. Unless there was a global flood. For example, marine fossils are found everywhere on Earth, including the top of Mount Everest.
The Great Flood. A topic which has been at the heart of debates for years. A topic so polarizing that a new breed of scientists, known as flood geologists, have risen to educate the academic world on what is true and what is false. But what are these fossils in the mountains they speak of? How is it possible that marine organisms are found at the roof of our planet, on Mount Everest? Well, buckle up, folks, because we're about to nerd out on some fascinating geological history. Welcome to EarthGuy Show. The fossil record is one of the most important tools we have for understanding the past. And in this episode, we'll be looking at the bizarre occurrence of fossils in places that you least expect, on mountaintops. This podcast is going to be split into two parts. In the first episode, we'll speak of Mount Everest, and in the second, Antarctica. The summit of Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth, is a sea floor. That may come as a surprise. After all, a sea should be at sea level. In practice, though, there is flexibility on this. 3 seas are below sea level. We have the Dead Sea, the Salton Sea, and the Caspian Sea. All are saltwater lakes which carry the name sea. There are also some seas which are above sea level, an example being the Aral Sea. It currently sits 42 meters above sea level, and it can therefore claim to be the highest saltwater sea on Earth. It is still some way off Everest, though. A sea floor should be lower than the sea it floors. Clearly, things have happened here that turned a sea floor into the roof of the world. The story behind this involves the highest fossil hunting on the planet, and not one but 2 lost oceans. It shows how trilobites managed to beat Nepal's famous Sherpas by hitching a ride with a carrier, becoming cargo to the top of the mountain itself. The presence of marine fossils near the summit of Mount Everest has entered the domain of common knowledge, so much so that the creationists and flood geologists now use it as evidence for the global flood. There are plenty of posts and articles that state that seashells are found at the summit, but few give sources of their information. It's almost like it's just everyone knows. But there's confusion about the fossils at Mount Everest. Shells are commonly mentioned of varying sizes, and even a few sites mention ammonites, and I've even found some that claim the presence of fish. Well, let's try and use this episode to uncover the facts. But before we do that, let's talk a bit about the geology of Mount Everest. The triangular mountain is instantly recognizable, mostly because there's always hundreds of people walking up the side of it. From afar, the structure of the mountain is a bit hidden behind snow, but there are clear visible layers that you can see, 4 main ones in fact. This includes a mixture of igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary rocks. And the ones we're most interested in are the unmetamorphosed layer of limestones. A metamorphic rock is any rock that has been exposed to heat and pressure, changing the rock from one form to another. One example is when limestone becomes metamorphic, it turns into marble. This is due to the increased pressure and temperature. However, lucky for us, the summit of Mount Everest is unmetamorphosed limestone. This is why we're actually able to find fossils in this layer. And when you look at nearby mountains, the same layers are seen in the same order, although not at the same altitude. This was due to a colossal orogenic event, which is a mountain building process. But where did the limestone on the top of Mount Everest come from? Well, the top layers of Mount Everest are made from marine sediment, a sea floor. But which sea, or rather which ocean? To answer this, we need to go back in time to when the Himalayas was formed. The Himalayas were a long delayed consequence of the breakup of Gondwana. Australia, Africa, South America, India, and Antarctica were all together in this supercontinent. Gondwana began to break up along the east coast of Africa, where a fault grew into the Indian Ocean. In the process, a fragment was split off and became adrift in this new ocean. The fragment split further into Madagascar and India. Madagascar stayed behind offshore Africa, but the fault behind India rapidly widened into an ocean and India was pushed forward north. Between India and Asia was the Tethys, a worldwide equatorial ocean running from China to Central America. India moved north, closing the Tethys in the process and forming the Indian Ocean behind it. The seafloor that was uplifted and shifted to Everest was from the Tethys. However, it wasn't the deep ocean basin that formed Mount Everest. That was mostly subducted during the plate movements. The mountain itself grew from the continental shelf and pushed up the sediments that was lying on it. So when did all this happen? Well, 50 million years ago, India completed the crossing. It failed to stop and crashed into Asia. The collision happened in two phases. First, India hit an island chain. This was a volcanic island arc that had grown out of the subduction zone. The island arc left its sign in northern Pakistan. Later, India hit Asia, beginning in the northwest and ending in the northeast in a drawn-out process. Originally, India had moved at breakneck speed, covering the distance at up to 20 centimeters per year. Just to give you an example, the Pacific Ocean today moves at around 7 centimeters per year. By the time of the initial collision, India had slowed down to 5 centimeters per year. This was all still well above the speed limit for safe continental docking. The continental plate of India slid underneath Asia and crumpled. The Himalayas are the crumple zone of that collision. The granite that forms at the heart of the Himalayas consists of the Indian plate, melted at high pressures at the bottom of the crust and thickened to 70 kilometers. The collision left India a lot smaller than it used to be. At 5 centimeters per year, India lost around 1,000 kilometers over 20 million years. And it's still moving today. It's really hard to stop that continent. So the Himalayas grew from below. In the process, they pushed up a layer of seafloor sediments. Once the new mountains pulled in the rains, erosion attacked them. This actually removed a lot of the material from the top, which is why only 6 of the highest peaks in the Tibetan area have marine deposits. The rest of the old seafloor has been carried away by giant rivers of the Himalayas and returned to the Indian Ocean. This explains why we find marine fossils in some of the highest regions of our planet. The distribution of these fossils in the mountains is also rather unique. Due to the way the crumple zone formed, the lower areas of the mountain are very metamorphosed or igneous rich, which means most of the fossils have been crushed and melted and are no longer visible. This is why we find most of our fossils in the upper parts near the summit, because they were away from the heat source. So here's something interesting. You would expect the fossils that are found on the top of Himalayas to be as old as the mountains, some 40 million years old. But no, the fossils are in fact 520 to 450 million years old. And these dates have been confirmed by the analysis of zircon grains in the sediments. The seafloor, or rather the continental shelf, that became the summit of Everest was ancient. It was much older than the mountains themselves. The sediments had been on the seafloor for a very long time before India came and scooped them up. Now, for all those geos out there, you would know that the Tethys Ocean formed around 275 million years ago. So if that's the case, then how do we have fossils which are older than the Tethys Ocean? Indeed, before the Tethys formed, there had been another ocean. We call it the Paleotethys. I know, not very original, but us geologists like to keep things simple. And due to the complex nature of that event, I'm going to talk about that in a separate episode. So definitely make sure you follow so you don't miss that particular episode. When you climb Mount Everest, you're not just reaching the summit of Earth. It's also a journey back in time. The mountain is young, as mountains go. The granite at the heart is no more than 24 million years old, and one day erosion will have taken it down to the level of this granite. But for now, we'll still be able to analyze the fossils that we find for those brave people that go up there to reach the summit. They're microscopic and broken down, but they allow us to see what life was like 500 million years ago. Oh, and don't forget, the Indian Ocean that we see today is just the grandchild of an ocean in which they lived. The fossils survived not 1, but 2 continental collisions. There you have it. The fossils found at the top of Mount Everest weren't from some biblical flood. In fact, the story is far more fascinating. It's a story that spans nearly 450 million years, where marine organisms that lived in the ocean settled to the bottom of a continental shelf and then were scooped up by a continent that came 300 million years later. And now they have a view most people pay thousands of dollars for: a seat on the roof of the Earth. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you so much for listening. We have daily uploads where we discuss the wonders of nature from a geological lens. I'm your host, MrEarthGuy. And remember, stay curious.